You've heard it once, and will hear it 1,000 times more. It's hard to talk about the Wild West period in American history without mentioning its inherent lawlessness and vigilantism that came along with it. Whether it was a rolodex of outlaws or bandits ruffling the feathers of innocent homesteaders, or Native Americans raiding wagon caravans, or greedy prospectors hiding gold in the hills, anything and everything was fair play on the western frontier. Some of the most fascinating lawlessness, however, came in the form of train robberies. Starting in October 1866 with the Reno Brothers train robbery in Jackson County, Indiana, and bleeding well into the 20th century, outlaws and amateurs alike saw the immediate fortune of a successful train robbery unparalleled to any other grift or long con. There were a few train robberies so infamous they left behind massive legacies through both stories and art, their participants more famous than some modern-day celebrities, despite the sometimes violent and deadly nature of the crimes. To further dissect their infamy, here are two tales of train robberies in the United States Wild West. The story of the Big Springs train robbery takes us back to the Nebraska Territory just before it was officially admitted to the Union in the mid-1860s. To the western end of present-day Nebraska, right on the cusp of Colorado country, was a small settlement known as Lone Tree. Lone Tree sat on land occupied by local Native American tribes for centuries, located right next to a large natural spring, which would provide water and nourishment for traveling caravans along the California and Oregon trails of the 19th century. The settlement received its name from the lone cottonwood tree that towered over the otherwise empty plains, providing a landmark for those crossing the prairie, whether it be stagecoach trails or the Pony Express. Eventually, the Union Pacific Railroad engineered their routes right through the heart of Lone Tree and named the depot spot Big Springs after the nearby water sources in 1867. The thought was that the water would provide quick and easy resources for the steam-powered trains. 9 years later, in 1876, two cowboys hailing from the Lone Star State, named Sam Bass and Joel Collins, led a cattle drive through the Big Springs area, heading north for the auctions and cattle markets. They paid no attention to the remote train station, but marked its location in the backs of their minds after passing through. Once up north, the two wranglers sold the cattle herd for $8,000 and were instructed to return most of the profits to Texas, where the cattle's original owners awaited their prize money. Unlucky for the Texas businessmen, Bass and Collins took the money and ran instead, seeing the $8,000 as an investment in their long-running scheme to prospect for gold in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. It was here the bad luck turned on the cowboys-turned-thieves, who arrived in present-day South Dakota and found not an ounce of gold. Of course, their $8,000 didn't last long when the rivers ran dry, and Bass and Collins were left with little choice besides embracing the outlaw lifestyle and committing crimes indefinitely. To kick off their newfound legacy, the pair picked a number of other outlaws to join their up-and-coming crew, namely Tom Nixon, Jim Barry, Jack Davis, and Bill Heffridge. The gang, referred to as the Black Hill Bandits, targeted stagecoach stations from around the Great Plains, hitting 7 in just a few months' time. This included 4 separate hits on the same line, the infamous Deadwood Station in Deadwood, South Dakota. The 5th attempt ended in the murder of Johnny Slaughter on March 25, 1877, and the profits were no longer seen as worthwhile by the Black Hill Bandits. Rather, they were attracted by the big-time potential of train robberies, despite no guarantees that they would get away alive. Lucky for the Black Hill Bandits was their leader, Sam Bass, and his knowledge of a quiet train depot tucked away in the Nebraska plains. Bass remembered his trek through the Lone Tree settlement a year prior, and brought the boys down south to Big Springs in September of 1877. As the sun went down on September 18th, the Black Hill Bandits snuck into the Big Springs train station where the station master, John Barnhart, was supervising the current shift. The outlaws surprised Barnhart and restrained him without much of a fight, and proceeded to destroy the telegraph. Once Barnhart was subdued by the loaded arms of the Black Hill Bandits, he was instructed to signal the incoming eastbound train to stop at Big Springs, without alerting them of anything wrong. The express train eventually rolled in and stopped at around 10:45 p.m. A few minutes later, at 10:48 p.m., Sam Bass and company hopped aboard the train, making way directly to the mail-safe car. Here, they gathered up a measly $450 that was stashed in the small mail safe, but hedged their bet with a much bigger safe located in another train cart. In a stroke of misfortune, though, the large safe was unbreakable, as it had been secured with a time lock that was only set to open once the train arrived at its final destination. Unsatisfied with the result, the Black Hill Bandits punished the assigned express manager until he cooperated, but even after a violent pistol whipping, he was unable to open the safe. Of course, Sam Bass had already come so far, he wasn't about to give up. They nearly made it through the entire train empty-handed until one of the men noticed 3 plain wooden boxes sitting off to the side of the locked safe. Within these wooden boxes were newly minted $20 gold pieces, totaling $60,000 altogether, which would be over $1.5 million in today's cash. Bass and Company couldn't believe the gold hadn't been protected in the safe, but didn't waste any time asking rhetorical questions. After the gold pieces were secured, the bandits turned to the passengers. Nobody put up much of a fight, and the men quickly acquired an additional $1,300 and 4 pristine gold watches from the innocent travelers. After everything in the train had been cleared, the Black Hill Bandits rode away from the robbery without issuing a fatality. They made a quick pit stop in Lone Tree, dividing their loot equally amongst the 6 outlaws, right underneath the shade of the cottonwood tree that had launched the depot's history in the first place. From Big Springs, the Black Hill Bandits split off into pairs. Sam Bass headed south with Jack Davis, as the 2 men disguised themselves as farmers with their gold stashed beneath the seat of their run-down, beat-up, one-horse buggy. In Texas, Sam Bass returned to his old abode, but not before Jack Davis attempted to persuade Bass to flee to South America with him. Bass declined, and Jack Davis was never seen again. Joel Collins and Bill Heffridge, another Black Hills pairing, weren't as lucky. 8 days after the Big Springs train robbery, a 10-man sheriff's posse, led by Sheriff Bardsley in Buffalo Station, Kansas, tracked down the 2 outlaws and killed them in a high plains shootout. The posse recovered upwards of $20,000, which was then returned to Union Pacific Railroad Company. Jim Barry met a similar fate. On his way southeast, Jim was detected in Mexico, Missouri, and captured by law enforcement. He attempted to escape, but was wounded in the process, succumbing to his injuries and dying just 2 days later. The final member, Tim Nixon, was last heard to be running north to Canada. His story was never resolved, however, as his $10,000 went unrecovered and the man was never heard from again after September 1867. The legacy of the Big Springs train robbery is now fastened into the lore of the Wild West. Of all its participants, Sam Bass saw the most notoriety blossom from his crimes. No longer would Sam Bass be remembered as the haphazard gambler who stumbled around racetracks or dance halls, failing to succeed despite scheme after scheme. Rather, he saw his legacy become similar to the likes of Robin Hood. Many would claim after Big Springs that Sam spent most of his money like he never had before, often paying for goods and services well above market price to benefit the less than fortunate on the other side of the counter. Of course, these feelings have been lost to the nostalgia of the Old West, as Sam Bass was really nothing more than just another outlaw. It's been said that after Big Springs, Bass returned to a life of robbery and holdups, not for the money, but for the thrill. He felt an adrenaline rush like no other, with all of the wanted signs featuring his face and bounty hunters hot on his trail. It's all just another chapter in the story of the mayhem provided by the Big Springs train robbery. In the criminal career of train robbing, no land was more ripe for action than the remote deserts of Arizona in the 1880s and 1890s. The most skilled of these Arizona train robbers were Bert Alford and Billy Stiles, former deputy sheriffs in the town of Wilcox. The pair had grown tired of the long hours and low pay that came with law enforcement in the Old West, and decided to shift towards a life of crime. Alford and Stiles immediately set their sights on the Southern Pacific Railroad, which had countless routes dispersed throughout the state. One such route went directly through Cochise, an unincorporated community at the southeastern tip of Arizona Territory. For 10 years, outlaws had ignored the government statute making train robbing punishable by death, and by 1899, Cochise was the perfect strike for Alford and Stiles to remain undetected by authorities. The two lawmen-turned-bandits hired 2 additional henchmen to ransack a westbound Southern Pacific Express along with them, and on September 9, 1899, the plan went into motion. The express messenger, a man by the name of Charles Adair, was quickly greeted with the end of a revolver as he opened the passenger car door. Alfred and Stiles then held up the entire crew, lining them up along the platform with arms raised until they detached the express car and drove it a few miles west into a remote, desolate stretch of track. After a few unsuccessful tries at the safe's combination located in the car, the bandits lined the car with dynamite and blew the safe door off its hinges. Within the safe, the 4 men found $10,000 worth of cash and gold pieces. Cochise Sheriff Scott White and U.S. Deputy Marshal George Scarborough chased the outlaws into the Chiricahua Mountains, but never picked up a cent, a failure that would soon bear further consequences on southern Arizona. The Cochise train robbery provided enough success to Bert Alford and Billy Stiles that they wasted no time in plotting their next big hit, this time targeting a nearby town called Fairbank, right off the shores of the San Pedro River. They teamed up with a local cattleman by the name of Bill Downing, who had helped the men organize the hit on Cochise. Alfred and Stiles wanted to change up their strategy. It had long been thought that most train robberies targeted train cars on the outskirts of major populations, out where law enforcement's reach was too far and escape was just a few feet away. However, the two outlaws believed gathering at a bigger train station would provide human shields between the criminals and the coppers, and knew the reward inside had the potential to be bigger. Thus, the men turned their attention to an incoming Wells Fargo Express train heading west towards Fort Huachuca, a U.S. Army post just 20 miles away from Fairbank. They believed it was carrying the United States Army payroll, providing quite the handsome reward. This time, Alfred and Stiles wanted to distance themselves from the action and return to Wilcox under their usual deputy sheriff titles. Meanwhile, they hired 5 other bandits to carry out the actual heist, including Bob Burns Brown, Bravo Juan Tom Yoas, brothers George and Lewis Owens, and Three-Fingered Jack Dunlop. On February 15, 1900, the night of the Fairbank train robbery, the 5 outlaws rode into town under the guise of drunken cowboys, stumbling around to fit in with the crowd, but not as to draw too much attention to themselves. There, they waited for the Wells Fargo train to roll into the depot. As it did, the messenger inside, Jeff Milton, opened the express car doors and stepped outside as the train came to a complete stop. It's then that the 5 outlaws revealed their true motives, pulling out their guns and aiming point-blank at Milton, demanding his surrender. At first, Milton believed the holdup to be nothing more than a ruse, but his mind quickly changed when one of the bandits fired a round that blew the messenger's hat off. He was just the substitute filling in for his friend, the full-time express messenger, and wasn't expecting a full-on robbery. Knowing his revolver was on the desk in the back of the car, Milton had to think quickly, and hesitated before lunging at the sawed-off shotgun propped up next to the door he was standing at. Unfortunately for Milton, the 3-second pause was enough to arouse suspicion, and the 5 outlaws started shooting at his position. One bullet hit square on Milton's left shoulder, shattering his arm and putting him on the ground. Just as Three-Fingered Jack was climbing aboard the train, however, Milton grabbed the shotgun with his remaining arm and fired a round directly at the outlaw. 11 of the 12 pellets tore through his body, while the remainder struck Bravo Juan above his thigh. As Burns and the Owens brothers continued to fire at the opened express car, Bravo Juan hobbled to his horse on one leg. Meanwhile, Milton was able to slide the metal car door shut, craft a homemade tourniquet for his injured arm, and hide the safe key underneath the luggage, all before passing out. When the uninjured outlaws reopened the car door and boarded the train, they saw Milton's unmoving body and figured he was dead. When they couldn't find the safe key, they gave up on the endeavor altogether and loaded the gravely injured Three-Fingered Jack on his horse before the gang of 5 rode away into the midnight sky with nothing more than 17 Mexican pesos. To avoid capture, the outlaws fled to the Dragoon Mountains. They left Three-Fingered Jack behind at the foothills with a bottle of whiskey, as he was too wounded to push forward, and the other 4 pressed on. The efforts were all for naught, however, when Cochise Sheriff Scott White finally caught up to the men as they struggled to cross a pass in the Dragoons. Down below, his men captured Three-Fingered Jack, passed out from his alcohol, and the Fairbank train robbery was over as quickly as it had begun. Of course, the aftermath was almost just as explosive as the crime itself. After law enforcement refused to believe Three-Fingered Jack's claim that Bert Alford was the rightful ringleader, Billy Stiles turned himself in to confess, unhappy with his measly $480 split of the original Cochise train robbery cash. The sheriff's office was pleased with Stiles' confession and allowed him to go free, arresting Alford and throwing him in the jailhouse in Tombstone, Arizona, along with the rest of the outlaws. The arrests were fruitless, however, when Stiles showed his true allegiance a couple of months later when he arrived in Tombstone, shot the deputy marshal, and freed Alfred and Bravo Juan. The other men were left in custody, and the three escapees went on the run for the next couple of years. Alfred and Stiles went on to rob more trains before Stiles was killed as a lawman under the name of William Larkin, and Alfred moved to Central America in 1910 and worked on the Panama Canal. Jeff Milton, the injured express messenger, was made a folk hero in his own right, receiving the praise and graces of many in southeastern Arizona for sticking up to the bandits and protecting the Wells Fargo Keep. Without a doubt, the story of the Fairbank train robbery was unlike most, as the good guys prevailed and the bad guys were left scrambling around the Old West, thinking about that next express train that could be their ticket to paradise and away from the mayhem of the western frontier.